The year is 1977. The place, a patch of sun-scorched earth off Interstate 29 in South Dakota, is generously named the Prairie Dog Oasis. It is not an oasis. It is a gravel lot, a diner emitting the holy trinity of smells, diesel, stale coffee, and frying bacon, and a dozen parked leviathans of the road, their chrome grills glinting like silver teeth in the early morning sun. The air is still, thick with the promise of a blistering summer day. At 5:47, that stillness was broken by a scream. It came not from the diner, but from the parking lot. A trucker, on his way to fuel up his Peterbilt, had decided to wake a fellow driver he knew by sight. The rig was a majestic Kenworth W900, painted a deep midnight blue, with the words "Iron Horse" airbrushed in silver script on the driver's side door. The man peering into the cab found Frank Miller, the truck's owner, slumped over the massive steering wheel. His face was a pale, waxen mask, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The local sheriff, a man named Brody, whose gut strained the buttons of his tan uniform, arrived first. He was a good man, accustomed to dealing with speeding tickets and the occasional bar fight at the local watering hole. A potential homicide in a truck cab was outside his usual purview. He secured the scene with yellow tape that seemed garishly bright against the dusty lot. He noted the lack of any visible trauma, no blood, no signs of a struggle. The cab was neat, almost unnaturally so. A half-empty cup of coffee sat cold in the holder. The air inside the cab was stale, but held no unusual odors beyond old vinyl and road dust. The preliminary conclusion was a heart attack, a common enough tragedy for men who lived on a diet of black coffee and greasy spoon specials. But something felt off. The man's stillness was too absolute, too posed. By 7:30, State Trooper David Vance arrived. Young, lean, with a sharp, analytical gaze that missed nothing, Vance was a new breed of lawman. A Vietnam veteran who had worked with communications, he understood technology and the complex subcultures that thrived in the modern world. He moved with a quiet efficiency that contrasted with Sheriff Brody's more ponderous pace. He ducked under the tape, his movements precise, his eyes scanning every detail of the Kenworth. He noted the polish on the chrome, the lack of dust on the dashboard, the neatly folded maps. This was a man who took pride in his machine. Vance donned a pair of thin latex gloves and carefully opened the driver's side door further, allowing the morning light to flood the cab. He leaned in, his gaze falling upon a small, leather-bound logbook resting on the passenger seat. It was open to the most recent page. The handwriting was neat, disciplined. Most of the entries were mundane, fuel stops, mileage, load details. But the very last line, written in the same steady hand, stood out. It was dated for the previous night. It read simply, "Met Dolly. Final delivery." Vance pointed to it. The medical examiner, a weary man named Peterson, arrived and made his initial assessment. He noted the bluish tint of Miller's lips and fingernails, the slight petechial hemorrhaging in his eyes. "Could be a heart attack," Peterson said, hedging, "but it could also be something else, something fast-acting. I won't know for sure until I get him back to the lab, but my gut tells me this man didn't die of natural causes." Vance looked from the placid face of the dead trucker to the cryptic final entry in his logbook. Final delivery. It sounded like an ending. Vance had a strong suspicion it was meant to be. The mystery of the I-29 was just beginning, crackling to life like the CB radio that sat silent on the dashboard. The cab of the Kenworth W900 was a world unto itself, a rolling office and a lonely home. For Trooper Vance, it was now a crime scene, a metal shell holding the last moments of Frank Miller's life. While the body was carefully removed and transported for autopsy, Vance began his methodical examination. He started with the basics. No weapon was found. Miller's wallet was in his back pocket, containing over $200 in cash and his driver's license. Robbery was not the motive. The coffee cup was carefully bagged as evidence. Its contents would be analyzed for any foreign substances. Vance ran a gloved finger over the dashboard. No dust. This was a meticulous man. He checked the sleeper cab behind the main seats. A bunk was neatly made, a paperback Western novel on the pillow, its page marked with a business card from a Sioux Falls tire shop. Everything was in its place, except the man who owned it. His attention then turned to the centerpiece of the trucker's social life, the Cobra CB radio. It was a high-end model with a custom-painted microphone. Vance picked it up. The coiled cord was cool to the touch. He keyed the mic. A burst of static, then the familiar chatter of the open road. He didn't transmit, not yet. He just listened. The language was a coded poetry of numbers and slang, a dialect foreign to most civilians, but one Vance had taken the time to learn. He heard truckers talking about smokies, police, four-wheelers, cars, and their 20 location. Sheriff Brody watched from the doorway, scratching his chin. "You really think you're going to find something on that thing?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "It's just a bunch of nonsense." Vance didn't reply immediately. He was looking at the logbook again, at the two names, Dolly and the victim's own handle, Iron Horse. These weren't names you'd find in a phone book. They were identities, broadcast over the airwaves, known only within this transient mobile community. The autopsy report came back late that afternoon, confirming Vance's suspicions. Frank Miller had died from poisoning. The specific agent was digoxin, a powerful cardiac glycoside. In controlled doses, it was used to treat heart conditions. In a large, undiluted dose like the one found in Miller's system, it was a potent, fast-acting poison that mimicked the symptoms of a massive heart attack. It was a sophisticated, almost clinical method of murder. It suggested a killer who was knowledgeable and careful. The poison had almost certainly been administered in the coffee found in the cab. The lab confirmed the coffee was laced with a lethal amount of the substance. Now the question was, who had shared that final cup of coffee with Frank Miller? Who was Dolly? And what was the final delivery? Vance knew that traditional police work, checking records, interviewing family, would be a slow, likely fruitless process. Frank Miller lived on the road. His community, his friends, and his enemies were out there, on the ribbon of asphalt that stretched to the horizon. The key to solving this murder wasn't in a filing cabinet. It was in the static, in the ephemeral conversations that bounced across the plains. He looked at the silent microphone in his hand. It was time to go on the air. The sun began to dip low, painting the vast South Dakota sky in hues of orange and deep purple. The prairie dog oasis took on a different character at dusk. The daytime heat gave way to a cooler breeze, and the neon sign of the diner cast a warm, inviting glow across the gravel lot. Inside his patrol car, parked in a discreet corner with a clear view of the interstate, Trooper David Vance powered up his own CB radio. He had positioned his vehicle to blend in, another anonymous sedan in the evening shadows. He took a deep breath, picked up his microphone, and keyed the transmit button. The familiar electronic chirp sounded, a prelude to his entry into this hidden world. He chose Channel 19, the most heavily used frequency for truckers. "Breaker 19, Breaker 19. Anybody got a copy on a northbound traveler?" he said, his voice calm and even, trying to mimic the casual cadence of a seasoned driver. The airwaves answered with a crackle of static, then a voice, distorted and rough. "You got the Midnight Rambler. Come on back." Vance pressed the button again. 10-4 Midnight Rambler. Appreciate the comeback. "Say, I was supposed to meet up with a good buddy fella by the handle of Iron Horse. Last I heard, he was making a stop around these parts. Anyone got an ear on him? He's in a blue Kenworth." There was a pause. The CB community was tight-knit, but also wary. A new voice, asking questions, was an object of suspicion. Another voice cut in, this one with a thick southern drawl. "Iron Horse? Haven't heard that handle in a bit. What's your 20, driver? You sound a little too clean for a long hauler." Vance knew this was a test. They were probing him, trying to see if he was a smoky in a plain wrapper. "Just a fella looking for a friend," Vance transmitted back, keeping his tone relaxed. "Was supposed to help him with a little job. Last I heard, he was talking about a final delivery, and maybe meeting some sweet thing named Dolly. He threw the name out there like a lure into a dark lake, hoping for a bite. The mention of Dolly changed the dynamic. It was specific. It was personal. For a few moments, there was only static. Vance wondered if he had said too much. Then a new voice, older and more gravelly than the others, crackled through the speaker. "You're looking for Iron Horse. You're too late, driver. Word is he's gone permanent 10-7, code for out of service. Dead." The news was already spreading through the network. "As for Dolly," the voice continued, a note of caution in it, "that's a name you best be careful with. Some folks get awful touchy about her." Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, she ain't just some lot lizard. She's the real deal." Vance felt a surge of adrenaline. He was getting closer. 10-4 on that, he said, just trying to make sense of things. Any idea where a fella might find this Dolly? Iron Horse said she was worth quitting the road for. A long silence followed. The airwaves went quiet, the other conversations ceasing as unseen ears listened in. Finally, the first voice, the Midnight Rambler, came back on. "Heard she pours coffee down at a spot in Sioux Falls. Place with a blue roof. That's all I got for you, driver. You be careful now. 10-4. The channel went back to its usual chatter, leaving Vance with a crucial piece of the puzzle. Dolly was real. She was in Sioux Falls, and she worked at a diner with a blue roof. The silent microphone had spoken. Sioux Falls was a different world from the lonely stretch of I-29 where Frank Miller's journey had ended. It was a city, bustling with life, traffic, and noise. For Trooper Vance, it represented the next chapter in his investigation. Armed with the cryptic clue from the CB chatter, a spot in Sioux Falls, place with a blue roof, he began a systematic search. He drove through the commercial districts, his eyes scanning the skyline, looking past the familiar logos of national chains for something local, something that would fit the description. It was classic, painstaking police work, a stark contrast to the high-tech eavesdropping of the night before. After nearly 2 hours of cruising the grid of city streets, he found it. Tucked away on a side street near the industrial part of town, not far from the stockyards, was a small, standalone diner. It was called the Blue Plate Special. Its roof was made of faded blue tiles, and a neon sign in the window, shaped like a coffee cup, flickered erratically. It was the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten, a relic from a simpler era. Vance parked his patrol car a block away and watched for a few minutes. A handful of trucks were parked in the rear lot, their engines idling softly. Men in work boots and faded jeans came and went, grabbing a quick meal before heading back to the warehouse or the road. The place fit. It was a hub for the very people Frank Miller had called his peers. He got out of his car, his uniform crisp and official, a deliberate choice. He wasn't here to play a role anymore. He was here as an officer of the law. As he walked toward the entrance, the little bell above the door jingled, announcing his arrival. The interior smelled of fried onions, strong coffee, and bleach. A long formica counter ran the length of the room, with worn red vinyl stools bolted to the floor. In the booths along the window, a few patrons hunched over their plates, conversations dropping to a murmur as they noticed the trooper's uniform. Behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth, was a woman. She looked to be in her late 30s, with weary but kind eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her waitress uniform was clean, but faded from countless washings. A small plastic name tag was pinned to her blouse. It read, Darlene. Vance felt a jolt of certainty. Darlene. Dolly. It had to be her. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral, but her eyes guarded. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Vance took a seat at the counter. He needed to handle this with care. This woman wasn't a suspect. She was, in all likelihood, another victim in this tragedy. "I'm Trooper Vance," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'm investigating the death of a man named Frank Miller. He was a truck driver. His handle was Iron Horse. At the mention of the name, he saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes, a brief, sharp intake of breath, a tightening of the muscles around her mouth. She stopped wiping the counter, her hand frozen in midair. "Frank," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Is he okay?" Vance looked into her hopeful, fearful eyes and knew he was about to shatter her world. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm afraid I have some bad news." The carefully constructed dam of her composure broke and her face crumpled, the truth of the situation crashing down upon her in the quiet, greasy air of the little diner. The hum of the diner's old refrigerator filled the silence that followed Vance's words. Darlene, or Dolly as she was known on the airwaves, sank onto a stool behind the counter, her face pale. The other patrons, sensing the gravity of the moment, respectfully kept their distance, a silent courtesy of the working class. Vance gave her a moment, then spoke softly. "Can we talk somewhere more private?" She nodded numbly and led him to a small, cluttered office in the back, a room filled with invoices, supply boxes, and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke. She sat in a creaky office chair, twisting a napkin in her hands. Vance remained standing, giving her space. "He was here," she began, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The night before last. He was so happy, so full of plans." Through her story, a new portrait of Frank Iron Horse Miller began to emerge. He wasn't just a stoic trucker. He was a man who had found a reason to park his rig for good. He and Darlene had met a few months prior, a chance encounter at the diner that blossomed through late-night phone calls and brief meetings at truck stops into a genuine affection. Frank was tired of the lonely, transient life. He had saved up some money and planned to buy a small house in Sioux Falls, settle down, and maybe open a small repair shop. "He told me he had one last job to do," Darlene continued, her gaze distant. "He called it his final delivery. He said after this one he was done. He was going to collect his pay, cut ties with his partner, and start his life over. With me." Vance's focus sharpened at the mention of a partner. His partner? Did he mention a name or a handle? Darlene shook her head, frowning in concentration. He just called him the Grinder. He said the man was difficult, all business. Frank said the Grinder wouldn't be happy about him quitting, that he was the brains of their operation, and the Grinder was just the muscle. The pieces were beginning to click into place. The final delivery wasn't to Dolly. It was the last job Frank would do for this mysterious partner. His plan to quit was the motive. A partner in a lucrative, likely illegal enterprise wouldn't just let the brains of the operation walk away. He knew too much. This delivery, Vance pressed gently. Did he say what it was? Or where it was going? No, Darlene admitted. He was always secretive about the cargo. Said it was better if I didn't know. All he said was that it was high-value electronics coming up from the south. He and the Grinder were supposed to meet up after he left here, somewhere on the road, to hand off the load and for Frank to get his final cut. She looked up at Vance, her eyes pleading. He wasn't a bad man, officer. He just got mixed up in something, and he was trying to get out. Vance believed her. Frank Miller's murder wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. It was a cold-blooded business decision. The Grinder couldn't afford a loose end. He had arranged one final meeting with his partner, not to pay him, but to silence him forever. The poisoned coffee, a seemingly friendly gesture between partners, was the murder weapon. Now Vance had a new target, a ruthless, faceless trucker known only as the Grinder. The investigation had a new, urgent focus: find the Grinder. The name itself was evocative, suggesting a man who was relentless, coarse, and destructive. Trooper Vance returned to his patrol car outside the Blue Plate Special, the conversation with Darlene echoing in his mind. He now had the motive and the method. What he lacked was a face and a location. Traditional police work began in earnest. He radioed in a request to the State Highway Patrol dispatcher, asking for a search on the handle, the grinder, in any known law enforcement databases or informant files related to trucking and smuggling operations. It was a long shot, but one he had to take. While he waited, he considered his next move. The grinder had the cargo, the high-value electronics Frank Miller was supposed to deliver. He would need to unload it, and soon. That was his vulnerability. Vance drove to a larger, more modern truck stop on the edge of Sioux Falls, one known as a hub for independent haulers. He wasn't looking for the grinder himself, but for information. He knew that in the world of trucking, reputations and rumors traveled faster than the rigs themselves. He spent the next few hours walking the lot, striking up casual conversations with drivers, mechanics, and dispatchers. He dropped the name Iron Horse, expressing condolences about the news of his passing, and then casually mentioned he'd heard Frank was working with a partner known as the Grinder. The name was met with knowing glances and a few curt nods. The Grinder was known but not liked. He was described as a lone wolf, unfriendly, a man who kept to himself and drove a dirty, nondescript Freightliner cab over. No one knew his real name or his regular routes, but they knew his reputation for hauling hot or undeclared freight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The dispatcher radioed Vance back. The Bolo, be on the lookout, for the Grinder, had rattled a cage. An informant who worked logistics at a warehouse in Omaha, Nebraska, had contacted his handler. He'd overheard chatter about a trucker with that handle looking to unload a shipment of top-of-the-line color televisions and stereo equipment, off the books and for cash. The description of the truck matched, an older, weather-beaten Freightliner. The informant provided a name, Gus Kowalski. A quick check of DMV records gave them everything. Gus, the Grinder Kowalski. He had a minor record for possession of stolen goods from 5 years ago. His registered address was a P.O. box in Cheyenne. More importantly, his Freightliner's license plate was now in the system. Vance felt the familiar thrill of the chase. The Grinder was no longer a ghost in the machine. He had a name, a truck, and a likely destination. He was moving south toward Omaha to fence the very cargo that had cost Frank Miller his life. The case was now a race down the interstate. Vance radioed his position and his intention to head south on Interstate 29, requesting that Nebraska State Patrol be put on alert. The hunt was on. Chapter 7. The Dragnet on I-29. The interstate became a blur of concrete and farmland as Trooper Vance pushed his patrol car south. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on the asphalt. He was in constant radio contact with dispatch, coordinating with units in South Dakota and the Nebraska State Patrol. The information about Gus the Grinder Kowalski had turned the investigation from a slow-burning mystery into a high-speed manhunt. An all-points bulletin was issued for Kowalski's Freightliner. Every trooper on I-29 between Sioux Falls and Omaha was on alert, their eyes peeled for the described vehicle. Vance knew that Kowalski would be cautious. He would likely be monitoring the police bands on his own scanner, but the advantage was now with law enforcement. They knew who they were looking for. An hour south of Sioux Falls, a report came in from a Nebraska trooper stationed at an overlook just across the state line. He had spotted a Freightliner matching the description, heading south at a steady, law-abiding speed. It was Kowalski. The trooper was instructed to maintain visual contact but not to initiate a stop. The plan was not to engage him on the open highway, which could lead to a dangerous pursuit. Instead, they would set a trap. Intelligence from the Omaha informant suggested Kowalski's destination was a sprawling, semi-abandoned industrial park on the northern outskirts of the city. A perfect place for an illicit transaction. The Nebraska State Patrol, with assistance from the Omaha Police Department, began to mobilize units to seal off the area. Vance, now operating in a support role to the Nebraska units taking the lead, felt a knot of tension in his stomach. This was the most critical phase. If Kowalski suspected anything, he could dump the cargo, abandon the truck, and disappear. They had to let him feel safe, let him drive right into the dragnet. As Kowalski's Freightliner rumbled past the exits for Omaha, he took the one leading to the industrial sector, just as predicted. The area was a maze of Rust Belt relics, silent warehouses with broken windows and weed-choked rail spurs. It was a place for things to get lost or for people to disappear. The radio chatter became clipped and professional. Subject vehicle is turning onto Industrial Avenue. Perimeter is set. All exits are covered. Air support has visual. Kowalski pulled his truck into the back lot of a long, derelict warehouse, parking it between two other abandoned trailers. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound. For a moment, nothing happened. Vance, positioned with other officers at a command post a quarter-mile away, watched through binoculars. Then the cab door of the Freightliner creaked open, and a man emerged. He was burly, with a thick neck and a face that seemed set in a permanent scowl. He wore a grease-stained jacket despite the heat. It was Gus the Grinder Kowalski. He looked around the empty lot, expecting a buyer, completely unaware that he was the one about to be collected. The order was given. All units, move in. The quiet of the industrial park was shattered by the squeal of tires and the synchronized roar of engines. From 3 different directions, patrol cars converged on the solitary Freightliner, their lights flashing in a dizzying display of red and blue against the rusted corrugated steel of the warehouse. Gus Kowalski spun around, his scowl morphing into a mask of pure shock and panic. For a moment, he looked toward the cab of his truck, as if considering a desperate escape, but the sight of a dozen officers emerging from their vehicles with weapons drawn made the decision for him. He slowly raised his hands, his face a mixture of resignation and fury. Trooper Vance was one of the first officers to approach. He saw in Kowalski's hard, cold eyes the complete absence of the hope that had illuminated Frank Miller's plans. This was a man trapped by his own life, dragging others down with him. The search of Kowalski's truck was swift and conclusive. In the trailer, just as the informant had said, were dozens of boxes containing brand-new color televisions and high-end stereo systems. In the cab, tucked away in a small toolkit under the passenger seat, investigators found a small, half-empty glass vial. The label was gone, but its contents would later be confirmed by the lab to be a concentrated solution of digoxin. It was the same poison that had killed Frank Miller. The case was sealed. At the station, under the glare of interrogation room lights, Kowalski's tough exterior crumbled. He began with blustering denials, but as the evidence was laid out before him, the poison, the stolen cargo, the testimony from the CB airwaves, he fell silent. Finally, he talked. His confession was delivered in a flat, monotone voice, devoid of emotion or remorse. Frank wanted out. He was going to take his share of the money and walk away. But Frank knew everything, their suppliers, their buyers, their routes. He was a liability Kowalski couldn't afford. The meeting at the Prairie Dog Oasis had been his idea. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one for Frank. He'd congratulated Frank on his new life, shaken his hand, and watched him drink the poisoned coffee. He then took the keys to the Kenworth, retrieved the cargo manifest, and drove away, leaving his partner to be found by a stranger at sunrise. He admitted to grabbing the logbook to check Frank hadn't written anything incriminating, but in his haste he missed the final cryptic entry. Met Dolly. Final delivery. It was this small oversight, this single line, that had unraveled his perfect crime. The case of the 10-4 tragedy was closed. Gus Kowalski would spend the rest of his life behind bars, another ghost of the interstate finally laid to rest. But for Trooper Vance, the resolution felt incomplete. He thought of Frank Miller, a man who had died on the very brink of a new beginning. And he thought of Darlene, back at the Blue Plate Special, left to wait for a future that would never arrive. The justice system had found its man, but on the lonely highways of America, where dreams and despair ride the same asphalt ribbon, some tragedies have no final, satisfying stop. They just echo in the static of a silent microphone.